But it is amazing that the things that we ultimately go through, the tests, turn into our testimony. And it's never any fun going through the mess, but once you come through the mess, you've got a message. And so I'm just going to share a little bit of my story. I was originally born and raised in Chicago, maybe even roll the clock back a little bit further. Both sets of my grandparents were from Russia and came out of Russia during the pogroms when they were persecuted. Fortunately, very few of our relatives ended up in Germany in the death camps and things, but some of our relatives did perish during in the Holocaust. But the majority of them, my grandparents, both sets of them, came over in the early 1900s to the U.S., the land of opportunity, and I don't know if you knew this or not, but in America originally, it was amazing. People, like as an example, one time the Scots, the Scottish were not welcome, the Irish weren't welcome, the Jews weren't welcome, and now I guess the Mexicans aren't welcome, with Trump. But my relatives came over. They couldn't get jobs, so they both started their own businesses as entrepreneurs. And my mother actually eloped with a Gentile when she was 15, which basically, if you're in the Jewish faith, you're supposed to be marrying in the Jewish faith. And her husband, her first husband, died in World War II, so she was widowed by age 16. And then my father grew up in Chicago and went off to World War II and came back to Chicago after the war. And he and my mother met. They married, quite young. And in fact, I think she was 17 when she got married the second time. And then they had my brother. His name was Michael. And then 2 years later, my sister Sage. And then I came a couple years later. So I was the baby of the family. And the first 5 years, we were living in the suburbs of Chicago. My father, like most parents, wanted to give his family a better life than what he had in the city. And he had his own business, but he also was working as a printer in the city of Chicago for the Chicago Tribune, and had a nervous breakdown, lost his job, and also lost his side business that he had. He was deep in debt. This is in the early 1960s. And my father lost everything. They basically bankrupted. They repossessed the house, the car, moved into a little two-bed flat in the city of Chicago. So my brother and sister and I were sharing a bedroom, and my parents. And after about 3 months of living in this flat, my father took his own life. And I remember as a kid at 5 years old being in the apartment with my mother, and a knock on the door, and the policeman came to the door and informed my mother, that they had found my father floating in Lake Michigan, and he had basically hung himself, and then the place where he hung himself basically fell in the water. And so we don't know if he, died from the hanging or drowning or whatever, but he had taken his own life. And I remember even at 5 years old, when I found that out, I didn't fully understand what had happened, but obviously I knew that there was no more father there. And my mother had a nervous breakdown. She started taking pills to sleep and alcohol to kind of numb the pain. And my brother was quite a troubled kid, so they sent him off to a boys' home when he would have been about 9 years old. And my sister and I stayed with my mother for about a year and a half, and she just continued to deteriorate. And then they took us away from her, declared her incompetent, and they put us into a foster home, which lasted, I think it was 16 days. And it was actually interesting because the people were Lutheran, and I'll never forget, it was at Christmas time. How many of you have ever heard of Hanukkah? Anybody ever heard of Hanukkah? Okay. So Hanukkah and Christmas are right at the same time. I knew nothing about Christmas, so this is like these people, they had a Christmas tree, and they're telling us about Jesus and about Christmas. And I said, but I want Hanukkah. And I remember their pastor came over, and we were sent upstairs, and we're sitting on the stairwell, and we could hear the discussion. And the foster parents said, the kids are a little bit upset because they're used to celebrating Hanukkah, and they're Jewish. And I can remember this. It was, I would have been 7 years old. And the pastor, the Lutheran pastor, said, "You need to get those damn Jews out of your house." And I remember thinking, wow, what did I ever do? So that was kind of the first bit of anti-Semitism that I'd ever really experienced as a kid. And so a few days later, we were moved out to an orphanage, and which sounds really sort of almost like Charles Dickens or something, but it was sort of here we go into this orphanage, and there's 20 or 25 boys, 20 or 25 girls, a whole staff. But literally for the first time in several years, all of a sudden we had a stable environment, and we have 3 meals a day, and we have structure, and we're going to school, and so it was just it actually wasn't. It was kind of like, wow, it's my sister finally could actually quit taking care of me, and she could be a kid. And so we lived there for a year, and then my sister was taken into a foster home. I stayed in the orphanage, and at this time I would have started Hebrew school and what you would call Sunday school, which in the Jewish faith would be called Shabbat, or Saturday for Sabbath school. And really kind of began my religious studies, and began to kind of learn the Hebrew language. But I remember, again, as a kid at 7, 8, 9 years old, thinking, I don't think that there really is a God, because if there was, why would my father be dead? Why would my relatives not take me in? And just confused, obviously, as a kid. I stayed in the orphanage, and then for another year after my sister, and it was actually about 6 months after my sister left, my mother died, so I would have been 8. And now I'm really angry. I'm angry at the world, I'm angry at God, and I'm really confused, why won't our relatives take us in? And the foster mother that my sister was living with, the foster parents, she started really lobbying for me to be able to live with them. So at 9, I get out of the orphanage and go live with them, and lived with them for about 2 years. And the foster mother and I were just like, we just clashed. And it was not a good situation. So my social worker, basically the foster parents said, we want to get rid of them. My foster mother and I were just clashing, and she'd beat me basically. But I knew how to push her buttons too, so it wasn't all her fault. And anybody have kids like that? They kind of know how to push your buttons, so. And so they're going to put me into a Orthodox Jewish boys' home, and I am 11 years old at this time. And I said to my social worker, if I could get a different family, because I had to go into a Jewish family, could I find a Jewish home? He said, Jeff, we don't have any Jewish homes. And so I called up my old scoutmaster and said, have you ever thought about taking in a foster child? And they said, no. Why, do you know someone? I said, yeah, me. And so they called up the social worker, and literally within 3 days they had me placed in this new home. So at 11 years old, I did my first deal, And so now I go live with this foster family. I'm 11 years old, and I start hanging out with the wrong kids. I'm in 8th grade and 12 years old, and I join a gang, and I start drinking and just hanging out with the wrong kids. And I got into some trouble, and my foster father and I got into an argument, and he smacked me, and I fell down some stairs. We got into an argument. And he said, you're just causing too much trouble. We're going to have to put you into that boys' home. And boy, that was just the wrong thing to say. So I went to my room filled with self-pity, and I had a drawing pad that I took out, and I started sort of writing down how bad my life was. Anybody ever had a pity party? And I just said, nobody loves me. My father committed suicide. My mother basically drank herself to death. Our relatives don't love us. I'm just a troubled kid, and life is not worth living. And before long, this two-page note turned into a suicide note. And I went into the bathroom, took out my foster father's, one of the double-edged razor, went back into my bedroom, slashed both of my wrists, got into bed, and someone said, were you just trying to get attention? No, I wasn't trying to get attention. I really was at the end of my rope. I just said, I don't want to live any longer. I mean, it's just not, I'm tired of getting kicked around. My foster father came up to the bedroom, and about 10 minutes later, said, I want to talk to you. He wanted to apologize, pulled back the covers. I'm lying in a pool of blood. They rushed me to the hospital, stitched me up, 57 stitches, and my foster father said, you can't come back to the house, so we're going to have to put you into a hospital. Now, to me, at 12 years old, I'm thinking hospital, so that's great. I'm going to get ice cream every day. It's probably kind of like when you get your tonsils out or something. And they put me in a police car, take me to a hospital, and they're checking me in, and then they put me in another police car and drive me to a ward. And the next day, I find out that that they've checked me in to Chicago State Mental Hospital on the ward for the criminally insane. I mean, it was just unbelievable. So I'm sleeping in this not auditorium, but this dormitory with probably 40 men in it. And I mean, I'm just a kid, and that most of these men are restrained. I mean, some of these guys are, rapists, and I mean, you just can't imagine. And so now I'm really ticked off at God. I'm like, God, how could you screw my life up so bad? I stayed there for 2 months, and then I ran away, and I lived on the streets until I was 15 years old. And the first 6 months, literally ate out of garbage bins, slept in alleys, slept in beaches. I would go to the back of restaurants at night and open up the bin and pull out whatever was in there. And, that's how I lived for 6 months. And then the winter came, and Chicago is probably kind of like Scotland. I mean, it is bitter. And so I started sleeping in a hallway under a stairwell, and somehow I had gotten a sleeping bag, and I was there for a few weeks sleeping under the stairwell. And late one night, these two guys come in, and they're laughing, and they're walking up the stairs with these big bags, and they're making all this noise, and I kind of popped my head out from underneath the stairs, and they said, "What are you doing under there, kid?" I would have been 13 at this time. And I said, "Well, I'm a runaway, and I'm homeless, and I'm just trying to stay warm." And they said, "Well, come on upstairs." And they gave me a place to sleep. And the next morning, they said, "Tell us your story." And these guys would have been 18, 19 years old. And I told them my story and told them I was Jewish. And they said, "We're Jewish." And they said, "Would you like to stay here with us?" And I said, "Yeah, especially for the winter." And they said, "Great, but you're going to have to work." I said, "Okay, what do I need to do?" And they took these bags and dumped them out on the table, and it was marijuana. And they said, "You need to, we'll teach you how to measure it, and then we're going to give you an address, and you can kind of be our our delivery boy." So I started delivering drugs on the streets, and before long, I started selling drugs. And then about 6-8 months later, these guys left Chicago and started a hippie commune, and they said, "Would you like to come with us?" And I was always quite entrepreneurial. I said, "No, but I'd like to take your business over, So they I kind of know who this wholesaler is, and I know who the clients are, and so now I've got a little drug business, or as my pastor said, "What was your first job?" I said it was pharmaceutical sales, and yeah. So I'm sort of going from, by now I've sort of met a bunch of other hippies in this building, and they'd let me sleep with them, and if I needed to, I'd sleep out on the streets or in an abandoned car, whatever I could do. There were a couple of times during this time where I actually got caught by the police, and they took me back to the mental hospital, and they would basically restrain me, shoot me up with Thorazine. I'd be in a quiet room for probably 10 days, and then I'd kind of slowly get my privileges back, and then I'd run away again. back on the streets. So at 15, I find myself, heavily using drugs. I don't know if I was really a drug addict, but I certainly, every day I'm doing LSD and cocaine and, smoking marijuana and hash and, just to numb the pain. And when I was 15, I just cried out to God. And I remember the night where I was lying in bed. I was staying with some other hippies. And I was crying, and I said, God, if you're really real, which you're probably not, but if you are, really the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, like I was taught when I was a kid in Hebrew school, would you please help me? And it was like at 15, I realized that I was hanging out with junkies and prostitutes, and I just looked at their lives and I thought, I don't want to end up like this. I'm going to end up in prison or in dead, it's just what a useless life. And I wanted to change, but I had no idea how to change. So I remembered that my friends had moved to Southern Illinois, 400 miles away. And so 2 weeks later, I hitchhiked, packed my rucksack, and hitchhiked to Southern Illinois to a little town called Carbondale, and went and saw my hippie friends. And I remember when I got there, there was this, old country mailbox, out there that I guess they have those here, don't they, out in the country? They're kind of where you pull it down, and on the side it's got the name. Anyhow, on the side of it, that was the name of the commune, was Cosmic Cowboys, okay? And I walked up this mile-long rutted road. It was out in the middle of a cornfield, knocked on the door. It was in the evening, and my 4 buddies from Chicago, the drug dealers, were all sitting in a circle, eating popcorn, reading some books, laughing, and it was in the summertime, and this is the summer of 1971. And I knocked on the door, and they came to the door and saw it was me, and they welcomed me in, and we probably chatted for, probably 5 or 10 minutes, and they said, hey, Jeff, do you want to join us? And I said, yeah, what are you doing? And they said, well, here, have a seat. So I sat down, and they offered me some popcorn, and I said, what are you guys doing? And they said, well, we're having a Bible study. And I said, what have you guys been smoking this time, And they began to share with me about Jesus. And they said, yeah, we went to this church a couple months ago. It was like 3 or 4 months earlier, and we all got saved. I said, well, I didn't know that you were lost. What do you mean you got saved? And they said, yeah, we accepted Jesus in our lives, and now we're Christians. And would you like to know more? And I said, guys, listen, I would never be a Christian. I said, because don't all Christians hate Jews? And they said, well, no. Said actually, the church that we're going to really loves Israel, really loves the Jewish people. And I said, all I've ever experienced is people not liking the Jews and anti-Semitism. And they said, no, in fact, Jesus is Jewish. I said, really? I thought he was a Catholic. I didn't know that. And so they opened up the Bible and started going through and showing me where that Jesus came from the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and David, and I said, well, that's great that he was Jewish, but it's not for me. No thanks, guys. And I stayed with them for a week, and they just kept loving me and not trying to shove Jesus down my throat, but just kept saying, Jeff, if you're looking for something that can satisfy, Jesus is a satisfier. Everything else is a pacifier. Drugs might make you feel good for a while, but Jesus makes you feel good forever. And so I was a bit disappointed. It was like, this is what I came here for. I didn't come here to be a Jesus freak. And so I got ready to head back to Chicago. And one of the guys, Michael Topple, said, Jeff, why don't you go to church with us at least once? And I said, no. And I said, I have no interest. He said, I know the reason that you won't go. I said, why is that? He said, you're chicken, aren't you? And I said, Michael, you ought to know me better than that. I'm a tough kid. I'm not chicken to do anything. And he said, well, then prove it. And I said, okay, what do I have to do? He said, well, just go to church with us. I said, okay, I'll go once. So that evening, we hop in his little Volkswagen Beetle, and we're driving to church, and he said, have you ever been to church before? I said, no, just Jewish synagogue. He said, well, this is a little different kind of a church. This is a Pentecostal church. And I said, well, Michael, I don't care how much it costs. I don't have any money with me, so. He said, no, not that kind of cost. He said, you'll see what I mean. So anyhow, so we get there, and I sit all the way in the back, had never been in this kind of a church before, and they start singing, and honestly, KCC, you guys are like a bunch of Baptists compared to what that night was like, okay? How many of you have ever heard the term holy rollers, okay? These guys were like real holy rollers, okay? And they're dancing up and down the aisle, and it was quite a spectacle for me. I'm standing in the back with my mouth open, and one of the guys, Michael, says to me, what do you think? And I said, hey, dude, this is almost as good as a Rolling Stones concert. And the service slowed down, and they began to sing a song called Coming Home. I don't know how many of you have ever heard that, Coming Home, Nevermore to Rome. And I don't remember a lot of what the pastor said that night, but I do remember that he said this. He said, when you accept Jesus in your heart, in your life, Jesus becomes he becomes your best friend. He becomes your brother. And his father can become your father. And I sat there and said to myself, well, God can never forgive me because of all the bad things I've done. But boy, wouldn't it be cool to have a real daddy? Yeah. And that night, at the end of the service, they asked who would like to receive Jesus in your heart and asked people to raise their hands. And there was a prayer. And I remember the prayer that I prayed. And it went something like this. Dear Jesus, please forgive me of all my sins. I don't understand why my life is so messed up. I don't understand why nobody loves me. But if you'll have me, I'd like to have you as my big brother and have your father be my father. And you may not believe it, but just like that, the scripture says you're a new creature in Christ. And I can't even hardly explain the feeling. At 15 years old, it was like lifting a piano off my shoulder. And I was still a confused kid, no doubt about it. But from that day forward, at 15 years old, that was in 1971, so almost 48 years ago, I've never had a desire to ever do drugs again, and my life really just turned around dramatically. And you guys can give the Lord a big hand on that one, okay? So Michael, who was was the guy that led me to the Lord, he was 21, I was 15. He became my foster father. And the pastor really became almost like my co-guardian. And these two men, and really the whole church became my family. I started getting back in contact with my Jewish relatives. I made a decision to not be bitter because I knew that bitterness, I don't know if you've ever heard this, but bitterness is like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. And I knew that Jesus had forgiven me, and for whatever reason they didn't take me in, that I could either be bitter about that or I could move on with my life. I remember my pastor telling me, he said, Jeff, don't allow your history to become your destiny. Let me say that again. Don't allow your history to become your destiny. And so I went back to high school. I met Margot, who was the only other hippie in the school. It was a very rural area. I was the only kid in the high school that had long hair that was a boy. Everybody else had crew cuts and short hair. It was a farming community. And here's this hippie kid that comes into the school. Even though I got saved a couple months earlier, I got to tell you, it was difficult adjusting to authority. The first day when I walked into school, and it was a biology class, my first class, and the teacher told me to be quiet because I was talking. And I basically said something that started with an F and told her to F off. And I got sent to I think you would call it the headmaster's, and he was a retired Baptist preacher. And he sat down with me and said, Jeff, you can't talk to people like that. You have to show respect. And I said, well, nobody talks to me like that. I'm a tough street kid, And he said, now, Jeff, you got saved a few months ago, right? I said, yeah. And he said, would you mind if I pray for you? Probably if he did that today, he'd probably get fired, And so typically about once or twice a week for the next few months, I was in his office. Because it took me about 2 months to get my mouth saved, Yeah. And so I really began to settle down. I began to realize that God was doing a work in my life, and learn to lean in and to realize that God could really do something special with my life if I just gave him my all. It was one thing to accept him as my Lord, but it was another thing to begin to discipline myself. And I really began to study God's word. I was always a hard worker. I was always a good volunteer in church. But for me, the church really became my family. Went on to high school, became an honor student. In the States, it takes you 4 years to go through high school. I made it out in 3. Became, it's like in the top couple, kids as far as students. And really buckled down. Margot and I were dating. I led her to the Lord when she was 16, and we dated. We went to university together. We got married when we were 19. And, we were just you think about it today, most young people wait till they get married till probably 20s or 30s or whatever it is. And we were just kids, but we were excited about our future. We were excited about what God was going to do in our lives. And then I got into financial services and did really well. And just it's interesting, in school, maths were my worst subject. But when there was a dollar sign in front of it, it kind of took on like a whole new meaning, And so we did really well. And then when I was 24, I met a guy that took me under his wings and mentored me in business. At 24 years old, my net worth was minus 10,000. So I was like most people, I was in debt and, was spending more than what I was making, and credit cards. And by the time I was 31, by just practicing not only the godly principles, but the practical principles that we teach, by the time I was 31, had become a millionaire. My 3rd year in business, I went to my pastor and I said, because my first year I was part-time and got out of debt. The second year I went full-time. 3rd year, Margot and I said to Margot, because I was serving on the board, I would have been 26, and I said, Margot, the church's mortgage, now I know, Pastor Ian, you'd love to have a mortgage like this. This is 35 years ago. The mortgage was $80,000. And I said to Margot, I said, why don't we step out in faith? We're good tithers, but why don't we step out in faith and take over the mortgage? And so I went to my pastor. I said, Pastor, Margot and I would like to take over the mortgage payment. And I remember he went into his study and he brought me the payment book and handed it to me. And I said, don't you want to pray about it? He said, no, I'm a man of faith. I believe God's been... I said, well, everything else you want to pray about, So. And I really do believe that that's one of the things that set us up for God's favor in our life, is that we continued to put him first. It wasn't about just getting a big house, a big car, big this, big that. It wasn't about becoming a millionaire. It was about becoming something that would attract people. And through our business over the last 35 years, we've led over 5,000 people to the Lord through our business. So, that's called ministry in the marketplace. We have a convention coming up in not next week, well, 2 weeks, and it's on a Friday. It's a Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then on Sunday morning we have a voluntary worship service. And I'd say last year, I think we had about four or 500 people that came to it, and we had about 75 people that actually got saved. Probably 60% of the people that work for me are believers, and many of them have come to faith through our business. And so God's just been so good to us. In 2003, our business was in the States. We were part of, I'm sure all of you have heard of Citibank or Citigroup. And it was actually in 2002, I was getting ready to kind of semi-retire and do some speaking and sell my agency in the States. And Primerica in the States, part of Citigroup, said, Jeff, we know that you're wanting to kind of semi-retire, but would you, the guy that I was reported to, he said, would you pray about moving to the UK and helping to found a new company for Citigroup? And I said, yeah. So Margot and I prayed about it. 2003, we sold everything. We moved to London in 2003. It was so exciting. We sold our 6-bedroom house in the US, and for the same money, we could afford a 2-bed flat in London, so it's pretty exciting. But it was an adventure. And then a year later, I met Pastor Gary, I met Hillsong. We became part of the life of Hillsong. And our business, in 2007, Citigroup shut that company down, bought us out, and Margot and I stayed in the UK, and we started a brand new company, Genistar, 12 years ago. And this is home. I think I've had a British passport now for 9 years. Haven't lost the accent, but I have pledged my allegiance to the Queen, So, and part of my life, I love being in business because it really is my ministry, but I also love coming and working with churches. I said today over this weekend, this is actually the last church that I'm speaking at for 2019, probably for 2020 also, just because we're just in a different season of our life. Literally in the last 24 months, our business has tripled, and in the last 9 months, our business has doubled. And so we're just getting so busy, and we're working with loads of churches, like what we did yesterday, raising up leaders like Jason and other people around the country to really teach how people can really get their lives together financially and how to become what we call a kingdom builder. And that is, money is so easy to let it distract you and pull you away from God. But when your heart is right, it is such a wonderful thing to be able to do things for other people and to be able to live off the top of the barrel instead of the bottom of the barrel. Obviously, from my story, I know what it is to be homeless. I know what it is to eat out of a garbage bin. I know what it is to be desperate. But I also know what it's like, to be doing well financially. And I really believe that a huge part of God's continual blessings are to take our testimonial out, like what I've just done today. And to realize that, and I keep quoting this scripture because it's up here, that it's not by our strength, it's not by our might, but it really is by the power of God in our lives. There's another scripture that says he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. So I've been a believer now for 48 years, and I want to tell you that when you're faithful to him, in fact, even when you're not faithful to him, he'll still be faithful to you. You can look all of your life. People are searching every day to try to fill that void in their lives with drugs or sex or money or power or fame or whatever it is. And they're all just a pacifier. But Jesus, when you accept him in your heart and you accept him in your life, doesn't mean that you won't ever have any more problems, okay? Even Jesus said, in this world you will have tribulation. But he said, be of good cheer, for I'm with you. And I can tell you at 62 years old, I'm still on fire for Jesus. I still got a lot of energy. Most of the young guys in my business, they say, Jeff, you're running circles around us. So I'm like your pastor. You better, I'm sort of like, Joshua and Caleb, we can still take the city. And so I'm really excited about being here with you, and I'm excited about what God has got in store for each of your lives. I want to tell you, if God could do it for me and turn my life around, an orphan kid living on the streets of Chicago, strung out on drugs, no hope, no future, I'm telling you, God can do anything. As the scripture says, all things are possible through God. I'd like to just pray for you here as we close this weekend out. Father, I thank you for this weekend, for the opportunity to share with this incredible church. I pray for Pastors Ian and Elizabeth. I pray for all the staff. I pray for the entire church. I pray for Aberdeen, that your covering, Father, would reach out to every single individual here, Father, that is seeking you. As your word says, ask and you will receive. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you.